Sister Ann, as we continue our journey into rediscovering the sacred, what are some of those things that come to mind for you when we think about those three questions? What have we lost? How do we lose it so fast? What are some of the things that we lost along the way, and how can we recover the sacred?
Well, David, first of all, I like the way you defined the sacred. You didn't have a really narrow box, but just God made everything good. And I think that's so biblical. There's a passage, I didn't look it up for this, I just thought of it just a few minutes ago. And I think it's the end of Zechariah or Zephaniah that uh, in the future, when the temple is rebuilt and everything, God will declare even the pots and pans in Jerusalem are holy to the Lord. Everything becomes sacred because it glorifies Him. Whatever we're doing can glorify Him. So yeah, our whole culture has to be godly, and that's what it has to be. And it used to be before I think the doctrine of evolution. People took it for granted. There were altars in every culture. Every archaeologist has found altars. Somebody always recognized that we did not make ourselves and that we owe something to a creator. And we definitely lost that in the last couple hundred years, and that's just gone downhill. But how did we get here? Um, uh, when I want to know where we are in the culture, I look to Our Lady. She is the prophetess for our times. She has been appearing all over the world, and with messages starting in 1830. And usually that's the job of the prophet, to point out what God sees as our major sins and what we need to fix and where we went wrong and how we can get back on track. And she started with 1830. That's on your miraculous medal. That from that time forward, she began giving messages to the world, and not just for some local thing or some personal thing, which she did for thousands of years before. But it's 1830. She started showing herself to St. Catherine Labouré, a little postulant, a lay sister, not a lay sister, but an active sister in France. And she pointed out, the miraculous medal, what is it? It is Mary standing on the serpent. She is that woman of Genesis. It's her time to crush not the little serpent in the garden, but the great big dragon in Revelation 12. So that was kind of announcing that she's at war now, and she wants us to be involved in that. And many people don't realize that she started showing St. Catherine Labouré visions of what was going on in France. They were having Paris was divided into sectors called communes, and they were rebelling. And that was where we get our whole idea of communism. And they think a young Karl Marx was probably watching that, how to rebel against the government. And so, and right then, I mean, France was already in the midst of the whole, it was trying to recover from the horrible French Revolution. But we know now that the whole French Revolution was inspired by Freemasonry, liberty, fraternity, and equality. Would you say, David, that equality can be you can transfer that word with tolerance? Tolerance seems to be the great religion today. We have to let everything go. Everything's okay, and everything's equal. All religions are equal. And so that's pretty much what Mary was starting to complain of. And so all of her major apparitions began in France. She keeps going to France, and France is really the icon of Mary. She is the icon of the bride church. She's the eldest daughter. And so I think that's why she focused on France so much, because she's sending a message about who we are as a church, the bride church. And it's going to be, are we going to be the harlot church of Babylon, or are we going to be the bride coming down from heaven in the book of Revelation? So I think that's where we are, how we got here. Just not, and the first three things she's talking about at right after 1830. She wants attention to herself, that this is her battle with Satan, and she wants that miraculous medal struck, and she's going to give graces with it to prove that she's part of this whole thing, and she's leading us in the battle. It's her. She is at battle with Satan more than anybody else, and that is as her place as the icon of the bride, because it's really the turn of the whole church to go through her crucifixion to be like her bridegroom. And so we're going to go through that as a body, and she will just expound on that as the apparitions around the world increase. We take them all together and listen to what she's saying. But right after 1830, she went to a Carmelite nun of Tours, and that was also Jesus was revealing himself as in revelations of the Holy Face, and he was complaining, and so was Mary, about the first three commandments. Those are all about worship giving to God. And what had France done? They stopped going to Sunday Mass. They weren't being a Christian nation anymore. I mean, that was part of the whole French Revolution to change the 7-day week to a 10-day week to get everybody off track. And so he said, you've got to be going back to Mass. You want Holy Communion, and stop taking the name of the Lord's name in vain. And so those first three commandments were vital. If we don't get God's worship, everything else we do for charity, the other 7 commandments, that's secondary. We first got to get that vertical union with God back on track. And but the bishop, the prioress believed Mother Little Sister Marie Saint Pierre, but the bishop wasn't too interested. He was one of those, probably a Masonic clergy. There were a lot of Masons in the clergy in those days. And so he just wouldn't publish, the statements that our Lord was asking for reparation. And so she started praying, Mary, would you just go tell somebody else? Because I'm not getting the message out. And so the next place she went was to La Salette. And that was her message about the public messages was about the first 3 commandments. And so it went on and on. So I would say that's where we are. Mary says we went away from worship to God and made it all about this world. And that's really the Masonic way, isn't it? Just it's very much this world religion, just fraternity with each other, success in business, and God is kind of, not real important. So that's where I would say Mary's telling us, and that's why that's where I feel called to spread Mary's messages, because she's the one telling us to get our act together.
Yeah, so Sister Ann, I think one of the key teachings of Freemasonry, I think that applies here, is just their core principle, their central teaching, their dogma of indifferentism. By indifferentism, Freemasons have built a whole country, so to speak. I think the United States, this idea of this deistic God, this separation of church and state, which Pope Leo and Pope Pius blamed them for. And indifferentism just says there's all religions are equal, that there's really nothing supernatural. And I think this has affected us a lot in the United States, but also I think around the world. And when we go back to the apparitions of our Blessed Mother Mary, I think at times we've been indifferentism. I could think of Our Lady of Kahibo and Rwanda, that I think we were indifferent to that message. And then perhaps other times we responded not as fast. And I think there's a consequence when we don't recognize the truth. We're just indifferent to the truth. So I was wondering if you can teach us why. Why is it that we are indifferent at times, and how does indifferentism affect us in regards to our pursuit of the sacred?
Well, you're humble to make that a we question, because you are not indifferent to your faith, David. You take it very seriously, and I just admire your apostolic outreach. You just give all your extra time to that, and you're just so generous in trying to get the word out to whoever will listen, and you are reaching a lot of people. But I would say there's a little secret about prophecies and Mary's coming to people. Prophets always talk about that if you all don't shape up, if the culture doesn't change, there's going to be a chastisement. And who listens? It's the very people who are not going to church, who don't care what God is saying, who do the very minimum, who show up just once in a while, Christmas and Easter people. It's those people who are never going to hear her, or if they do, sometimes it's a very superficial. Their rosary turns colors or something. It just lasts a short time, and they're back to their old ways. So really, and that's what we saw. I compared this moment in history is almost parallel to the 200 years of prophets. Almost all the prophets in the Old Testament are in a 200-year window before the fall of Jerusalem, because God kept saying, you guys, you have introduced so many other religions into Jerusalem. You welcome so many other gods, and you're just making a syncretism of everything. And Mary is saying something very similar here, that God's going to burn down the whole thing, and you're going to think the church died, because God he will not stand competition. He's either going to burn it down and we're going to start over. And that's what happened. He sent them all off to Babylon, and they came back with a remnant and built a really strong Judaism from there. And I think that's what we're heading for now. But what good was 200 years of prophets? I mean, they killed them, they stoned them, they made fun of them. It's a total waste of time. Why does God send prophets when he knows they're going to be rejected? He doesn't send prophets really to convert the bad. He sends them because they're preaching to the choir. It's those who believe who really listen. And those who believe are saying, look at how bad things are around here. We don't like the way our children are being, introduced to all sorts of evils. We don't like this. We don't like this. And the other people are saying, well, everything's fine. This is good. We tolerate this. We just respect each other. No, we have a narrow parameter of what is good and what is right and wrong. And it's so comforting to hear a prophet, someone speak in the name of the Lord and say, God is upset too. It's not just you who are upset. You're not imagination. God is upset. And probably they're not going to convert. But after the chastisement, I promise you, we'll rebuild. The Messiah will come. It will all be good. And that's what Mary's been saying over and over. Fatima, what did she say? In the end, my immaculate heart will triumph. And that is what that's the people I reach, are people who are listening to her, and they want to hear that over and over. Okay, it's getting bad, but in the end, yes, we're on the winning side. It's going to triumph. Maybe we won't see it, maybe our kids will, but that's what we have to hold on to, David. And that's really what it's for, because there's a lot of people who are not indifferent. And I tell you, and I can tell you, just as, because I kind of dress as a nun right now, you'll explain, I'm between communities. I was a Carmelite nun for many years, and I hope to start a new congregation. So I still kind of dress like a nun, because I'm not going to waste time figuring out a hairdo and earrings and all that stuff. But just going up to the cash register, people who are not Catholic, who don't know me from Adam, they just see that I represent something about Christianity, and they'll just start spilling out, like, how bad our country's going down. Are we at a Christian country? Where are things going? And I've just met so many people from the Gulf Coast to up here to Wisconsin, all over the Midwest, and they're all concerned. We have a lot of Americans of all denominations who are good, right-thinking people who are praying, but they don't make the news. Thanks to you, a few of us make the news, but there's a lot of good people in this country, and they are listening to God, and they are not indifferent. And so sometimes the media gets all the microphones, and they plaster the big names, their big names, which they have made big. But really, it's really a tiny minority that are running things. But we'll be sucked in that way if we don't fight against it.
But that was the first time I ever heard, Sister Rand, someone speak of the idea of speaking to the choir as like a positive thing, like that. So why does the choir, and you said this in so many words, but I wanted to see if you could say more about it, that, like, why does the choir need to be affirmed?
Because you're made to feel like you're all alone, and that you're the only one who thinks this way, and that many times people in our family have also left the church, or else they're compromised with a lot of the teachings. They're into affirming this and that, which is not part of the gospel. And so after a while, you start questioning yourself. And I'll just remind you what happened in Poland. Many people have already forgotten, but when John Paul was first elected Pope, he was coming from a very communist country, and the communists were very unhappy that their own countrymen, made it to Italy. And John Paul kept saying, I want to come home, and I want to celebrate Mass for my people. And they did not want that, because they did not want any religion going on in that country. And they were constantly made people to think that anybody who went to Mass, they had some churches open, but anybody who went to Mass should keep their head low and they're going to get punished, and nobody else was doing this and they're alone. And so but John Paul just kept threatening the government. He said, well, if you tell me I can't come, I'm going to let the whole world know that you're lying about freedom of religion in these communist countries, blah, blah, blah. So John Paul put in a pressure on them. They finally let him come in. And so he had a mass in a park. I don't know where it was. I can't remember, but there were like tens and thousands of people jammed together in this park. As far as you could see, it was just people wrapped in attention, happy to be at the mass, thrilled that they had a pope. And people started looking around and they said, my gosh, everybody's Catholic here. There's only a communist way over there, a communist standing way over there. He said, I thought I was this tiny minority, and here we're the majority. And see, that's the way the media does it. And that's what they're doing. They're gaslighting Americans right now to make us think we are almost alone. And so that's why, and actually I will tell you, because that community is dissolved now. I started out in a Carmelite monastery in southern Missouri. There wasn't any in Kansas. I was born in Kansas. So I went to southern Missouri, and it started out as a good community, but then it just, there were some things creeping in, and some bad retreat masters and an indifferent bishop. They're all dead now. But I was all alone, and I kept thinking, I don't think this is good. And I never even knew what the New Age was. It was totally new to me back in the late 70s, early 80s. And I just thought these doctrines aren't good. And so at night I would go and read encyclicals, and I got the most help from Pius XII. He was a prophet, Mystici Corporis and Mediator Dei. He was already calling out a lot of the errors that I was seeing. I thought, gosh, why don't the others see it? This is so strange. And I was just felt so alone. And whenever I tried to say anything, they would just marginalize me. At first, they elected me to one small position, and then no, I don't like the way she's talking. So I was left in the basement most of the time. But that they weren't keeping me from keeping the rule. And that's all you want in a cloister. And what I was hearing about some other monasteries wasn't good. So I just figured, well, at least I can keep the rule. And then one day I found a whole case. Someone had left a whole case of the Marian movement messages that she was given to Father Gobi. And I started reading that Mary is saying exactly what I'm feeling, exactly what I'm running into. And I just felt so affirmed, so comforted. And that just made me strong. And I never backed down after that. I thought, I'm on the winning team. And pretty soon the doors opened. John Paul, it was a long story, but anyway, I got out of that monastery, went up north to one in St. Paul, and it was 20 years up there. It was happily ever after. So it was a good thing. But yeah, you can feel very isolated, especially in your family or work,
Yeah, I never thought about it like that. The remnant, the prophets, is really just God being merciful. I never that's a good thing to hear. But in light of that, how would you say that? Well, how did we get here? In spite of God being merciful with us and communicating with us, sending His word, His prophets, the apparitions of our Blessed Mother Mary. How would you say that we were still arrived here at this point where indifferentism has seemed to become this religion?
Well, I mean, Mary has said it. I mean, she was pointing out from 1830 that it was communism, the principles of communism. She said it would grow. And then at Fatima, she said, absolutely, you've got to do something quick or it's going to be full blown all over the world. And it doesn't mean necessarily that we wave red flags and call ourselves communists, but we've adopted communism in our universities now. We've got a soft communism all over our country. And so it has spread. And it all seems so good because what was the Acts of the Apostles? Sharing everything in common. It's very close. All the weeds are very close. They almost look like the real deal. It's very hard to weed a garden in the very beginning because they look very close. And that's why Jesus said, just let them grow up together and then separate them, because you can hardly tell the difference at first unless you're really careful and astute and living a deep spiritual life. And so I would maintain that there is a strong remnant that is living that spiritual life and has been following Mary's messages. But yeah, the rest of the world, most of it has gone down the garden path. And And I would say that, and part of communism, I read in different things, part of it was spread immorality because that weakens people. So sexual liberty, the contraceptive mentality, all of that. Oh, live in sin before you get married. Test out your marriage. Make sure you want this partner. Yeah, that never works out. But yeah, all these wrong things, and what they do is put us in a state of mortal sin, and then we're not in a state of grace. And when people are not in a state of grace, they lose the light. And people don't even have common sense when you lose the state of grace. You're in darkness because you're in a certain bondage to Satan, and he's got you in blinders and clouds. And you can still be a nice person in many ways, but you're not. You're really not. You belong to him. And so it's gradually captured our world bit by bit, like the frog in water. But so I say there's a lot of frogs who are not in the water, but yeah, there are too many. It got into our culture and brought us down. Sin, temptation, and I would like to throw in something that just I saw it on a YouTube, that something led me. I guess I was following the financial crash, something like, where do you put your dollars right now? Do you keep them in dollars or convert to silver? What do you do? And what people have given me, I try to be frugal and prudent with it. And so I read something. I wish I'd have taken notes, but it was very, very shocking that a lot of the financial situation we're in now wasn't really the decision of big names. It was many, many, many businessmen over decades who compromised, who knew that they were exporting, that they were making deals on dividends, the things that was not real money, and they were speculating, and they were having people invest in their company, and then they would take paychecks on projected earnings. They were playing games with money, and they were also trying for cheap labor, and that's really defrauding people of a fair wage. So just because you can get it done in another country for something cheap, are you really looking at how those people are living? Do they have a fair day's wage? And was it right for you to make a huge profit on somebody else's labor? So there were many, many little sins by many people. We like to blame the deep state and the big names, but really, and how many people have compromised with sex in the family? Just how much incest went on in the family? How many sins went on? How much greed went on? Housewives wanting this and this, pushing their husbands to work more hours and be away from home. There's just many, many little sins that did it. I think I don't really want to point at big names. I think everybody has to take some responsibility. You build a city with a lot of little bricks. You don't build them with one brick here and one brick there, and that makes a big city. No, it escalated.
I was just really shocked when in 2019 or 2020, when the whole the pandemic started, and then an election followed that. And I think we can say there was a period of time when a lot of people didn't know what was going on. Things seemed to be confusing, but as time went on, it was clear to I guess a lot of people that we were being lied to about a lot of things. And I guess over history, we could even go back to, I don't know, what happened in Iraq in the 1990s, when we were told they had these weapons of mass destruction, and then later on we found out, oh, these were lies. And so these are just some of the most recent things I could think about. But what's going on, sister? And that we're just so okay. If sacred isn't being pursued, or there's a diminished sense of the sacred, that means that something else has been filling in that space, and it would seem to be that, well, it's lies that have filled that space. People seem to be more inclined to live the lie than they want inclined to live the truth. And I think this is everything you're talking about: communism and Freemasonry and differentism and sin, the pervasiveness of it, pornography, and just all this stuff. So what's going on in our conscious and in our societies, where the lie has filled up such a big space?
David, who is the father of lies?
Satan.
It just proved to me you can't, even on trusted channels, people talking heads, I want to believe them, but where are they getting their information? It's like you can't trust any source right now, no matter where you go on the internet, the news, or your friends. You just wonder, the sources we used to trust, can we trust those? And we're finding more and more is lies the farther down you get. It's like right now you don't know who to believe, and you lose your sense of balance when everything is a lie. And that to me is the proof that Satan is ruling right now. We are moving into the time of the Antichrist, because John Paul nailed it before he was cardinal, and Pope Paul VI really admired him a lot, Wojtyla, what he was doing with his publishings and all this stuff. And he invited him to give a retreat at Lent in the Vatican. And Wojtyla wrote he gave a retreat. If you ever read it, it's published as a little book called The Sign of Contradiction. And I used to use that for prayer so many times. But he's a man who grew up in the communist era. So they were constantly getting bombarded with propaganda. And, that was Lenin or Stalin. If you say it enough times, eventually somebody will believe the lie. And he said they were so tired of the lies. But he said, what is the lie? It's the anti-word. And so the anti-word is really the prelude to the Antichrist. And I think that's where we're at right now. We're just surrounded with anti-words. We don't know. And so that's one reason I am a little bit merciful to some people in my family who believe some of the lies, because, well, they're not sure who to trust, And so why are my sources better than their sources? How can I prove everything? In Carmel, I meditated many times on the Passion of Christ, and I was often struck and comforted that Jesus knew that that Judas knew where they would be meeting at the cenacle and the upper room, and that when Judas left the gathering at the Last Supper, Judas knew where Jesus always prayed at the garden in Gethsemane. That was their normal place, and Jesus did not let that knowledge get hidden. So he was allowing himself to be betrayed, because only as God did he know what was going to happen. So normally we don't know who our traitors are. Only God knew. But Jesus said, yes, it's human to be deceived by the people we trust. And, that night, none of the apostles guessed it was Judas who would be the traitor. Judas had worked miracles. Judas took alms and distributed alms to the poor. Judas he looked very good. And so we get deceived by our leaders, and it's painful not to trust them. And it seems disrespectful. And so, it's just natural for us to trust our elders, people who know more than we do. We depend on people to be specialists in different fields.
Based upon that, Sister Ann, what do you think we've lost along the way in sense of the sense of the sacred?
Well, we can make a long list of the things of the sacred that we're sorry we lost. And my grandparents could tell stories about, living in a small town, and there weren't even any locks on any doors, and old cars didn't even start with a key. They just started with a button. People had a lot of trust in smaller towns. It would be wonderful to go back to those old days. And yet, no, I don't. I think, we lost a lot, some of that sense of things that would have been good, but I think we lost something important that it was time to lose, and that was our childhood. The church is supposed to be a bride, but she had to mature over the centuries until she could reach that time for marriage. And this is an exciting moment. And the whole book of the Apocalypse is all about a big wedding feast. It's time finally for the church as the body to act as the bride of Christ. And what happens after marriage? That is the time where you become fruitful. And Christ becomes your progenitor, and you become fruitful. I mean, we have not converted the world. That's what Vatican II was all about. It was a pastoral council. It says, great, we're doing great. We have lots of vocations, But there's 6 million people back then at the planet, and we've only got 1 million Catholics. So where are the other 5 million? We're not evangelizing well enough. We're not engaging with the world enough. And that's because I think we have to become bridal. We have to become holy. And until we reach that real state of union with Christ, and that requires going through those that dark night of the spirit, the dark night of the soul. We have to be purified, and that's painful. And but also we have to understand where we're headed and be excited to make those sacrifices, to give up self, to be in union with Christ. And then Christ becomes the principle, and he becomes our fruitfulness. And that's where we will convert the world. And so I don't think it's such a bad thing what we're going through. Yeah, it's painful, but I think I think lay people like yourself. I mean, I see so many lay people who are stepping up to evangelize in their mission. That in the past they would say, well, that's for nuns and priests to do that. Well, yeah, maybe it's a good thing that nuns and priests have been confused and have stepped back and lost their way. Yeah, the lay people are running into the fire with the fire hoses and say, let's do something. And now they understand also that the priests and the sisters have their place, and we all need to work together because the church is a trinity. It's a family. There's the father of the family, that's the priest who brings the bread and the discipline and the rules, and then there's the sons who are Christ in the world. That's the lay status, who are supposed to. They're the ones who engage, rub shoulders with people who are not Catholic. They're the ones who are supposed to bring the gospel to the world, not the priests. I mean, and the sisters. I mean, non-Catholics aren't going to talk to those people. It's you lay people who are supposed to be doing that. And then there's the mothers who are religious, and traditionally most religious have always been female, and that's the role of the Holy Spirit. And then the mother in the family, she flits around, keeping the family together. She watches what the husband is doing, encourages him in his business. She's watching what all the kids are doing, encouraging them in their careers and their choices. And she's connecting everybody. And that's what religious do. They're supposed to connect the priests and make sure he's reaching all, and everybody in the parish is understanding them. And so the religious are supposed to be in between. And right now, the religious have gone astray because Satan has really confused them about their identity. And he went after the mothers of the families first. He wanted them, oh, you got to vote, you've got to be in sports, you've got to go to the universities, you've got to carry a business card. And pretty soon, what became of our families when the mother wasn't there most of the time? She lost her place. And the church has kind of fallen into confusion when the sisters lost their identity. And that's surprising, but it's the Holy Spirit who has that invisible role. But I'm excited. I'm excited that the lay people have finally realized, and that was the whole point. Most of Vatican II was for the lay people. It was for that was a pastoral council to declare dogmatically that everyone is called to the highest degree of union with Christ. You're all called to the heights of union. And that was always debated over the centuries. Well, maybe lay people shouldn't have that burden placed on them. It's just the priests and religious are supposed to strive for that, and lay people shouldn't have to. And Vatican II said no. We're all called to that. It's part of our baptismal role. And so I just find so many lay people going out to get doctorates, and they're taking theology courses, and they're so hungry for the truth. And it's helping them to stand up against all the lies of our times. And so I think we lost our childhood. And, that doesn't mean we don't have happy memories. It doesn't mean the childhood wasn't important and that we can't recognize the good in it. But we're not supposed to stay kids forever. We're supposed to grow up and have children of our own. And so I think the church is going to be moving into a very fruitful, wonderful era. And that's that 1,000-year reign that the apocalypse promises. But we have to get through. We have to get through the chastisements and the war and all that ugly stuff first.
So that was very positive. When you were speaking, I was thinking about the papacy of Pius IX and how during his papacy, the papal states were lost under him, and how he had a long pontificate. And he had to make this transition of no longer being this like monarch type of pope. in this transition where he had to figure out, well, if I don't have to rule a bunch of papal states, well, maybe we can just focus on the spiritual things. Maybe we could just be church and not empire. But over time, yeah, I see that simplicity, that the trajectory that Christ has been and the Holy Spirit has been leading his church to be more simple, to be more pure, and to focus on those things that are ordered to our salvation. So yeah, that's quite phenomenal. And so that's a positive message. And if we were thinking about the question, like, well, where do we go from here? How do we recover that sense of sacred? Well, how would that then therefore fit within the which you're talking about, the 1,000 year reign and the chastisement?
I think maybe we already went there in the sense, but you brought it. You mentioned the monarchy pope. We want that pope to be the father of all and tell us what to do and be that strong symbol, and we just be the children who obey him. And it was John Paul who felt the burden of a church that was just vast. I mean, it had outgrown Europe long time before he got there, and the church was so enormous, and for him to appoint bishops in all these different countries, he knew that he didn't know all these men. He could not possibly vet all these people. And so he had to delegate. And he kept saying, we've got to get away from, trusting only that whatever the Pope says is this. I mean, we've got to learn to delegate. And that's why he really wanted to beef up the College of Bishops to make them understand their responsibility and make the church branch out so it wasn't such a heavy burden on the Pope. And many people criticized him that he didn't stay home behind a desk and answer all these questions and make all these decisions. But he wanted to be with the people too, and really getting a sense of what the church needed. And he kept reaching out over and over and over to the Orthodox brothers. And he said, yes, we believe almost everything the same, but the main problem is the primacy of Peter. You don't want that to be exercised so monolithically. And he says, what can we do to find a way that you would accept Peter as the monarch and that I could delegate a lot of this stuff? How can we approach that? And he kept asking that question over and over of the bishops and of the Eastern Church. And even the Protestants have problems with, they want some authority, and yet they don't want the Pope to just be the king. And it's not right. I mean, it was never meant for every last thing that a Pope says on a plane trip or in a book or whatever is not meant to be from ex cathedra. And we've really lost that. I mean, we've never gained a good sense of where do we go. And so I think we're just in that growing stage. I think the church is like a teenager now trying to move into adulthood, and we're kind of rebellion. There's some rebellion. There's flexing our muscles, and yet we admire some adults in our lives, and yet we want to be the adults ourselves and make our own decisions. And yet, so yeah, it's a difficult place to be. We are living in a transition moment, and it's not comfortable. It's not easy. But right now, Satan's method, and it's in his communist method, it's almost every military method, is to get your enemies divided so that they don't stand united up front against you. Let them start bickering among themselves, and then you can pick them off. You can go after smaller groups. It's when they stand shoulder to shoulder that you have a hard time taking them on. And right now, they're trying to divide the Catholic Church into good Catholics, serious Catholics, not just indifferent Catholics, but they're trying to divide good, strong Catholics against each other, and they're going after these silly liturgy wars, which I'm sorry for saying silly, because a lot of it's based on very superficial they just grab a slogan and people run with it, thinking that they have to defend the church and grab the football and run to the next mark. And we've got to run together. We've got to play together. And so this whole thing with I think the Latin language is kind of proof that we're in that moment of shedding our childhood, our past, to move into adulthood. And the Latin language is a part of some of those things of our past that we don't want to give up. And there's a true and false in that. We can't just renounce our whole childhood. That would be wrong. All of our heritage, all the traditions, all the things we grew up with, all of those are good things. But to move forward, we have to move into the next level. And the church went through this twice before. In the very beginning, the church, what were those first early apostles doing? They were meeting in the temple. They didn't even understand after Jesus died that the church that there was a Christian church and a Jewish church. That didn't occur to them. They just felt that the Jews had predicted the Messiah forever, and they were devout Jews because they recognized the Messiah. And so they kept going to the temple for the liturgies, and they kept meeting for the Psalms daily and praying those. And those Psalms were sung to certain melodies that had been 1,000 years old. David had composed those melodies with some of the other Levites. And so they sang those songs in Hebrew, in the Hebrew language, and they knew those songs back and forth. But it wasn't their everyday language. They were speaking mostly Aramaic. And so, but they knew that was their liturgical language. But they were, but the synagogue, a lot of the synagogue liturgy, was not really liturgy. It was what they worshipped in at their local towns was in the Aramaic. And so there was a mix there. And so when they moved out beyond that, they kept those psalms with them. But then they started moving into the bigger church. And in the first 300 or 400 years of the church, most of the Roman Empire, Greek was the common language. And that went back to Alexander the Great. And people don't realize that Greek, even though they had Roman soldiers everywhere, Greek was the language for commerce, for trade, for getting your international news. And so Greek was really the language. And so that the church began to, and the Jews had already translated the whole Old Testament into Greek a couple of centuries before. And so the church began celebrating her liturgy in Greek. And so we've got 2 words left of the Hebrew. We got Alleluia and Amen. That's the extent of our Hebrew language. And in Greek, what have we got left? Kyrie eleison. That's about the extent of our Greek heritage left. And now, but what were they speaking? They were not speaking classical Greek. That's a very complicated word. That people just learned a basic Greek, which they called Koine or kitchen Greek, and that was for trade. And but in their own dialect, there were hundreds of dialects all over the Mediterranean and Europe, and people spoke every day their own language. But for trade, they learned a little bit of these common languages, and that was kitchen Greek. And the whole New Testament, almost all of it, is in kitchen Greek, which has about 50 nouns. I mean, it's low-class Greek. And it's something people can learn. And so when the Greek Empire, the whole empire was spilling against, and so we had 2 emperors, and so we had the Roman emperor was living in Constantinople and took the Greek side. Then it all got the Latin emperor in Rome. They had the Latin. So pretty soon the liturgy had to change to Latin because people weren't speaking Greek much anymore. They were speaking a low class Latin. It was not the classical Latin, which is a very complicated, difficult thing. Now they were using common Latin. And you know the word for common? It's vulgar. And you know the name of the common Bible? The Pope in the 400s, he commissioned St. Jerome. He said we got to get away from the Greek and the Hebrew. People don't understand that. We need a common language Bible. So I want you to translate that into Vulgate Latin, common Latin. So it was a low-class Latin, and pretty soon it became kind of a dead language. And so that became the Latin that most people used as a common language for everything. Even until like the 1960s, many universities in Europe were still using Latin. Their professors were teaching in Latin. They weren't even. It was just common because it was the language of everything. But you know what the common language is now? English. Almost everybody on the planet, if they're going to learn a second language, it's English. And part of that is because of the British Empire that conquered so many places. And so if you wanted, they were governing in English, and many of these places like India, they might have 200 or 300 dialects. So if you're going to have one language, teach English in school so you have something in common. And so that's what they did in the Philippines, all over the place. And so pretty much people learned English, And then the computer world broke forth, and that was American software. So if you're going to learn the computer, you study English computer manuals. And do you know where most of the medical and dental books are printed? In English in America. So like if you're going to go to dental school, I know this because my brother's a dentist, so he goes all over the world giving conferences. And I said, well, how do you handle all those interpreters? He goes, well, I never have an interpreter. If they went to dental school, they learned English so they could read the dental books. They don't translate all the dental terms into Polish or Swahili or something. You just learn it and then get it in the theory, and then you move on. And so most of the world is English, right? All the pilots, they have to know English if they're going to talk to the what do you call it? The tower people, whatever they are. Yeah, so if they have to know a basic English. So now we're moving into, and English isn't a friendly language. It's difficult to learn. And Latin isn't the most easy language to learn either. And I'm sorry, I wish it was something easier. I think Spanish is probably easier. But English is what people are striving to deal with, our completely crazy language with so many exceptions, more than rules. But that's where we're moving. And people are going to have to face it, that we have to move on. We don't have time to keep up multiple languages. And but it's true that we do have almost a 1,500-year history of the church in Latin. So we've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, thousands, I guess, of manuscripts and writings in Latin. And those things cannot all be translated into all the modern languages. And for canon law, we need a definite, precise understanding of a dead language that doesn't change. That will always be good, but it's our own history. So that we have different rites in the church, and so though they keep some of their music and stuff in their original language, but then the rest of the liturgy is in something people understand. And so that was the principle of Vatican II. It wasn't to get rid of Latin. It was only to make the liturgy accessible to people and the scriptures. And so these wars over Latin, and it's just sad because and it's just sad. But yeah, so Satan is trying to divide us over things that we should be standing together. So I think we need to grow up and get past it and say, we'll deal with all the liturgy things later, but let's stand firm together for our culture, for the principles of what against the sins of our time.
Sister Ann, thank you for this catechesis and instruction on our return to the sacred. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, David, for inviting me.